A little bit about the Rivers Trust. We are the umbrella body for the Rivers Trust movement in England, Wales and Northern Ireland, and now we're also providing some support in the Republic of Ireland, and we work closely with our sister body in Scotland, the River and Fisheries Trust of Scotland. So we do provide support in Wales, so David, definitely come and talk to me if you need some help with GIS and data support. But we have grown rapidly over the recent years, and I'm going to give a bit of an overview of really how SCIMAP has been integral to the growth of the use of data and evidence in catchment planning. So Rivers Trusts, for those who aren't familiar, there's about 56 now. I think that's maybe even increased since I put these slides together. That's in England, Wales, Northern Ireland. There's another 24, I think, in Scotland. Back about a year ago when we last summed up our totals, we had over 250 staff. The income is growing year on year, really bringing funding from all sorts of places, not just government, but European funding, water company funding, or bringing multiple funding pots to bear on catchment management. And at least 20,000 volunteers, that's almost certainly increased now as well. So the sort of works that Rivers Trust get involved with, it's all about delivery really and engagement. So habitat works within the river, looking to improve fish stocks and fish habitat, cleaning up the sediment that we see getting into the river, gravel cleaning to improve spawning habitat for fish, but obviously looking at tackling the sources of those pollutions, so that's where SCIMAP really comes into bear. But tree planting, looking at blocking those pathways for sediment and pollution and improving the sort of flood risk downstream. Looking at sort of fencing and excluding stock and livestock and sort of bankside management. Farm infrastructure and farm advice is a big area that Rivers Trust are involved with. And also opening up the sort of connectivity on rivers, so fish passes. We've put in hundreds of fish passes over the years and barrier removal to properly connect up rivers. So improving that habitat, but also making it accessible to fish and other species. But also tackling invasive species is a big thread. And really around that, it's sort of engaging the community, getting volunteers involved in managing their rivers and doing a lot of education and partnership building alongside that. So data and evidence is really key to what we do, as well as helping us strategically plan where we work within catchments. We are opportunistic. We work where we've got good relationships with landowners, but we also increasingly take a whole catchment view and plan where we're going to work based on priorities. So it's about prioritising fieldwork. We always get our wellies on and go out on the ground. You know, a model's only going to take you so far. But it helps you decide where you go and do that field work and where you put your measures. And it's really about, data and evidence is about engaging stakeholders. You'll see some fantastic maps and outputs today from some of the Rivers Trusts. It's really about communicating what that data and evidence tells us. And increasingly we need to be looking at evaluating those measures that have been put in and seeing whether or not we've been successful. So SCIMAP for us has been a really useful tool. There's sort of some key reasons for that. It's been very accessible to us, not just because the software is free, but also we've partnered really well with Durham University over the years. So we've helped to inform the development of the model, and Sim and his colleagues have always been really accessible to us to help us understand the data. But also the input data has been relatively easy to get hold of. It hasn't always been that easy, but it's improved massively. But also you can produce some really engaging outputs from SCIMAP, and some of the things that West Country and other Rivers Trusts have done, draping the model over 3D terrain and producing some really engaging stuff. That makes a huge difference. So I thought it would be good to have a quick overview of how SCIMAP use by Rivers Trust has developed over the years. It's been a long time actually. 2004, Lucy Butler, who now works for us, was doing her PhD on SCIMAP, and she joined Eden Rivers Trust and started using the model within that catchment. It's always about the Eden, isn't it? So, and then we started to develop some training resources under the Pinpoint project, which is partly funded by Natural England. That's still ongoing, looking at diffuse water pollution from agriculture. And then we had a DEFRA-funded strategic evidence and partnership project back in 2010-11, which was really looking at the role of data and evidence from third parties in river basin planning. And SCIMAP was a key tool that we explored and used in that. So we started to get a growth in the number of users in the Rivers Trust. DEFRA then undertook the pilot catchments year, really, which was the precursor to the catchment-based approach. And all through this process, we've seen the number of SCIMAP users growing and the ways that SCIMAP has been deployed also expanding. And it's been really fascinating for me to go round the Rivers Trust and gather these examples together and see how everyone's using it slightly differently and exploring different ways to use and combine the model with other data. And I got very excited when my SCIMAP became available nationally just recently, because I think this is really going to be a great leap forward. It's going to make it even more accessible, and I think we've already produced some really exciting outputs from it. So I think it's a good time to be involved, really. So I'm going to give you a few examples of how Rivers Trusts have used SCIMAP over the years. So Eden Rivers Trust, as I mentioned, back in 2004, developed the rapid assessment of the river environment methodology. So SCIMAP was actually a key tool in this, but they were combining that as a decision support tool with electrofishing outputs and water quality measurements, and they had aerial photography methodologies, remote sensing methodologies to map the channel and substrate and look at issues. And this really was used to target the subcatchments within the Eden and then target individual farms and fields for land management advice, the sort of measures that you've seen earlier. And when I was doing this, I learnt for the first time what SCIMAP actually stands for. I don't think I ever knew that before. It's the Sensitive Catchment Integrated Modelling Platform. There you go. I've never heard it called that. So during that study, they found a really good correlation between siltation that they picked up from that remote sensing and the mean connectivity that SCIMAP was modelling. So that gave them more confidence in the model. And they also found a correlation between water quality issues being picked up and the connectivity risk across the whole catchment. And what they found was, looking at the electrofishing results, they were able to sort of determine a threshold, really. So the green areas on the map, if you can see, are where connectivity, the surface flow connectivity, is really the limiting factor for fishery health. So again, it was giving more confidence that the model can help to both make assessments across a whole catchment, but also help to make decisions where you haven't necessarily got that other data set. So moving on, we had a project which was DEFRA funded in 2010-11, the Strategic Evidence and Partnership Project. We worked with the Environment Agency and 3 of our Rivers Trusts, Severn Rivers Trust, Wyenask and West Country. And each catchment we were looking at using decision support tools and third-party data, walkover surveys, maps and models to help build a consensus of the issues and really target those interventions. And SCIMAP was found to be really useful for that sort of landscape scale assessment. We used one of the sort of first uses that Severn put the maps to. The in-channel risk was actually used to target walkovers within the Ree catchment. This is a small sub-catchment of the Severn. And they'd walked the main channel and there was huge sediment issues there, but really it's a big old catchment. They didn't really know where to start. So they used the in-channel risk to help prioritise which of those tributaries they were going to walk first, and then going out and looking for the evidence of siltation in the channel and finding, a reasonable correlation, even at a sort of fairly coarse scale with fairly old land cover data. And then this helped to underpin a catchment restoration fund bid to tackle some of the issues in that catchment. and that led on to the River Restoration Project, and they delivered something like 32 kilometres of fencing and riparian habitat restoration, and around 50 farms that were given guidance and advice. And taking the SCIMAP model out as one of the sort of suite of data and evidence packages was really key to that. And a lot of barrier removal or fish passage as well, opening up that habitat that was being improved. So another application where we supported a Rivers Trust was Voluntary Rivers Trust in Northern Ireland. And they had a freshwater pearl mussel population. So obviously freshwater pearl mussels are globally endangered, but they had a genetically distinct population there that was in danger of extinction. So they had an HLF-funded project to identify and tackle sources of sediment and create a sanctuary population and do some captive breeding and education. So in terms of identifying the sources of sediment, they asked us to help them run SCIMAP. So a bit more challenging in Northern Ireland because the availability of data, certainly back, this is about 3 years ago, wasn't so good. We could only get hold of 10-metre digital elevation data, and the Careen land cover map isn't as detailed even as the land cover map and was quite out of date. So there was probably a limiting factor there, and much of the problem in that catchment was actually bankside erosion and livestock poaching. So SCIMAP probably gave them less information about, what the issues were or helped them to target things. But what it did do was provide a sort of visual piece of evidence they could take out with them with farmers. And it helped focus attention on soil vulnerability. It started to give them sort of questions to ask and go out and search for more data and evidence. And so Mark Horton, who's the director of Balan Trust, what he said was it was a really critical thing for convincing stakeholders that they were an evidence-based organisation. And I've heard this over and over again from Rivers Trust. Even if the maps don't directly lead to a specific decision on the ground, what they do is show that you are using data and evidence to underpin your assessment of a catchment as part of a whole package of evidence. And this led on to lots of sort of implementation work and keeping cattle out of the river, and lots of kilometres of river improved to rescue those pearl mussels. So I'm not going to talk too much about this example because I know Ellie's presenting on it later, but Ribble Rivers Trust have really taken the model and run with it and worked with SIM to develop additional sort of decision support tools on top of it, and we really hope we can roll these out to other Rivers Trusts as they become available. So really looking at combining with lots of other data sets to prioritise decision making and pinpoint areas on the ground where you can implement measures, such as tree planting. So another example that Ruperts provided, so the Wessex Chalk Streams and Rivers Trust are working in partnership with Hampshire and Isle of Wight Wildlife Trust on the Test and Itching Catchment Partnership. And that partnership has identified sediment as one of the key issues in the catchment. So they initiated the Sediment Pathways project, which was really about identifying the sources of sediment, the pathways, and the impact on the receptors. So SCIMAP outputs, which were developed for Natural England, were provided in PDF format. And this is quite an important lesson to pick up on here. They didn't actually get hold of the raw data sets to put into a GIS. They were just provided as PDF. But what they found was they went out on the ground and collected wet weather walkover surveys, and they also did some sediment-sensitive invertebrate sampling as well. But because they only had the PDF maps for SCIMAP, they needed some additional information on those flow pathways, some more detail. So Rupert's developed a methodology to get the flow pathways using the free LiDAR data from the Environment Agency. So I think this is a really key lesson here. People share PDF maps quite often, but if you can't get hold of the really detailed data, you can't then overlay it with your own information. So being able to get access to the data sets as well as the published maps, I think, is really important. So maybe now that sort of my SCIMAP is available and more readily accessible, people can generate their own maps if they can't get hold of the data. But this really underpinned detailed farm plans which set out the interventions, how to trap and slow down sediment, putting in riparian measures and sediment traps and so on, and sort of trackways. And there has been some post-project monitoring of the suspended solids, which shows some improvement post-works, but yeah, I think it's only a year ago these were put in. So Y and Us Foundation have also used SCIMAP, and they've taken it on a step further. So Hayden Probert actually presented at the last SCIMAP user group meeting on this. They have a big farm advice programme tackling diffuse water pollution from agriculture to improve the SACs. And they run the model initially and run it with an all-arable scenario, so a sort of standard land use risk, so really looking at vulnerability rather than just basing it on the 2007 land use. The farm advisors then take this initial map out on the ground, talk with the landowners and farmers and discuss the issues that are highlighted on the map, and they do some ground truthing. They look at, has it picked up some of the issues that are visible on the ground? But also critically, they update the land use. So getting some proper up-to-date, particularly, the arable and open ground and pasture. But also, they ground truth the ditch and drainage network. So they're adding in details about the drainage ditches that you might not even get from things like the detailed river network. And then this data is taken back into the office, and those DEMs, the ditches, are burnt into the DEM, so you actually improve the resolution of the drainage ditches, and the models rerun with the improved flow pathways and the up-to-date land use. And what they find is this gives, counterintuitively, I think, that's the top map there is the risk before the sort of improved DEM. What you find is because the flow pathways are diverting flow, you're actually disconnecting some fields, even though you're sort of speeding up the transfer from others. So this gives some sort of improved resolution, and then the model outputs are used to prioritise key areas within the catchment, but also to prioritise the farms that are visited, and then that goes into the farm advice plans. So you'll hear as well from Nick Paling later about some of the ways that SCIMAP's integrated into whole catchment sort of ecosystem services mapping in the urban area. But back during that strategic evidence and partnership project, Nick and his team developed some really great sort of visualizations of where ecosystem services are provided in a catchment. And SCIMAP's a key layer to input into several of those. The sort of water quality and the water resources layers and the flood layers are all based on flow pathways. And there's a whole series of these visualizations now that West Country have produced for a whole load of rivers trusts. And really they're about sort of combining lots of different data sets into a sort of strategic overview of your catchment, which areas are important for providing multiple services. Because if you target your interventions there, you don't just improve your water quality, but you might reduce your flood risk and sequester carbon and increase biodiversity. And we've then taken some of those outputs and shared them via ArcGIS Online. Nick and his team have developed a guidance document to help others follow that methodology, and Bristol Avon catchment, Wessex Water, have taken that and developed their own outputs and shared them online as well. And they've become a really useful discussion tool and communication tool, as well as informing project bids. And some of the work that West Country have done on upstream thinking, they've started to evolve how they use the model. So multiplying up those output layers from SCIMAP, the connectivity, the source risk, and the in-channel risk, and actually summarising this by farm and by field to help prioritise where you go out and work with farmers. And something that Ellie's worked on recently that I think is worth highlighting, because I think this could definitely have potential, is looking at scenario modelling. So what if? So starting with a small subcatchment where there were a series of farms that West Country were working with, and looking at modelling some of the specific interventions like ditches and impoundment ponds that were used to trap sediment, and actually burning these into the digital elevation model. And what Ellie found was that if you ran these separately, you couldn't directly compare the risk. So she came up with a novel way of basically running the two catchments at the same time by spatially offsetting them. And what that resulted in was some initial outputs which start to show you get disconnected channels or you reduce the risk in channel. I think it's fair to say for this farm it wasn't, a massive improvement, but I think it's a really interesting methodology, and I think it's something that, several people would be interested to follow up on. It'd be good to see where that could evolve. So catchment water quality assessments, again, another West Country project for Natural England. A lot of the sort of protected areas now have had these whole catchment water quality assessments. SCIMAP is a key tool in this, but linking in with other source apportionment tools like source apportionment GIS, farm scoper, water quality measurements, integrating with the CABA partnerships local knowledge, and really sort of linking all this together into a whole catchment assessment. And what James and some of the other guys at West Country have done is really sort of drill down, run the model for the whole catchment, but then drill down into the detail and start running smaller high priority areas at sort of 1 and 2 metre resolution. And then starting to, again, develop vulnerability maps, so running, instead of giving your risk per land cover parcel, running a single constant of, I think, 0.1 as the risk. So that gives you a vulnerability map. So if you change the land use, this is more vulnerable than this. And then summarising that per farm and field parcel. And then combining that with lots of other data and evidence to give a really rich picture, and use that for sort of communicating and engaging with landowners so that you can go and implement some improvement measures on the ground. Another example of where SCIMAP's fed into some exciting work, over in the Cam Ely in East Anglia, we've been working with Norfolk Rivers Trust and Anglian Water and Coca-Cola and Sainsbury's. This is under our Waterlife project, which is a EU-funded project to really look at water stewardship and agricultural supply chains and how we can really engage with stakeholders and get a more certainty around the data and evidence that influences measures. So Coca-Cola were interested in reducing the sediment risk associated with their sugar beet supply chain, and Sainsbury's interested in their sort of supply chain impacts, really, and particularly around pesticide and raw water quality as well. That was the sort of Anglian Water interest. So what we did was to use SCIMAP in combination with other models, again, some of the usual suspects, and farm holdings were ranked really by a weighted risk and then refined down to field scale. And each farm had a farm evidence pack produced, so the farm advisor could go out and sort of really sit down with farmers and look through the evidence. And what SCIMAP really did was help with the sort of pathway part of the source pathway receptor approach. So really looking at where sediment and associated phosphate, but it did give some understanding about pesticide transfer as well. And each of the sort of sources, pathways and receptors were ranked for different elements, including we're now sort of looking at incorporating flood risk in this. My colleague Dave Johnson's been doing some really exciting work up in the northwest, and we're now growing what we could do with this. But it's just giving an objective view of what's going on in the catchment. And again, we were looking at sort of scenario modelling, so taking the standard erosion risk using the sort of off-the-shelf land cover map 2007, and then also producing a vulnerability map just using a constant risk. And the difference in this is giving that future risk. What might happen if you make the wrong decision in the future? And all of this feeds into those farm evidence packs. We've undertaken similar work up in Cumbria and Derbyshire now as well on the Foston Brook. So in Cumbria, Nestle, we're looking at how they could improve their resilience in their milk supply chain. So again, combining lots of data sets to look at how you can understand the connectivity in the landscape and the transfer of pollutants, and then building that into a sort of weighted farm and field scale risk, turning it into farm plans and advice leaflets for the farm advisors to take out on the ground. Trent Rivers Trust have undertaken some work with SCIMAP in the Willow Brook, again under the Waterlife project. They had the cooperative and farm care who were interested in working with them. They wanted to identify areas where they could improve the flood risk downstream in Leicester, but also improve water quality as well. So what they found here, SCIMAP really strengthened the dialogue and gave them some effective communication tools. And the landowner has the surface flow index map up on his wall still, so they saw that as a success. And really the outputs from that, we had an initial go at sharing these on ArcGIS Online back a couple of years ago, and these were used, particularly the surface flow index in this case, to target flood risk measures. So small interventions, leaky dams, riparian tree planting. And we're now looking at using this on the sort of next iteration for Trent Rivers Trust on the Potwell Dyke. We've got another EU project looking at flood risk. And so we're very interested in how SIM's developing the SCIMAP flood model as well. And one that I've done very recently for Trent Rivers Trust, helping them use the My SCIMAP app to target diffuse pollution measures. So I've shown them how to run the model online and how to share the outputs on ArcGIS online. I've trained all the staff, and I've now got a video that I've shared with other Rivers Trusts as well. So really putting the power in the hands of everyone who wants to use the model. So where next? Well, I think My SCIMAP is fantastic. I think it's a really welcome development. It makes the model a lot more accessible. We've shared the how-to video, and it'd be great to see what other sort of training products we can put together and just make this accessible to non-GIS specialists. We're going to hold workshops over the next 6 months with CABA partnerships. One of the sort of metrics we've got this year is to get everybody developing a spatial catchment plan. SCIMAP is a key element to sort of spatial planning and catchment, so that'll form an important part of that. Where would we like to see the model going next? Well, definitely Northern Ireland and the Republic. We'd like to be using the model there to support catchment work. And we'd really like to integrate SCIMAP with some of the work we're doing on citizen science and volunteer monitoring. So I'd be really interested to hear about SCIMAP Fitted. I really want to get to grips with that. But also it'd be fantastic if we could start to link this up with some of the other platforms and systems we're developing. We're working with Earthwatch to evolve the Freshwater Watch platform for citizen scientists to collect water quality samples. We're also looking at extracting data out of the Open WIMS database, the water quality database from the Environment Agency. Wouldn't it be brilliant if we could start to link these things up and plug the results from one into the other and really start to leverage the power of joining things up? So that's enough from me, I think. Thanks very much.